This podcast is supported by Progressive, a leader in RV insurance. RVs are for sharing adventures with family, friends, and even your pets. So if you bring your cats and dogs along for the ride, you'll want Progressive RV insurance. They protect your cats and dogs like family by offering up to $1,000 in optional coverage for vet bills in case of an RV accident, making it a great companion for the responsible pet owner who loves to travel. See Progressive's other benefits and more when you quote RV insurance at progressive.com today. Progressive Casualty Insurance Company and affiliates. Pet injury is an additional coverage and subject to policy terms.
Canada is set to jettison decades of diplomatic policy, throw aside the stated will of Parliament, and recognize, unilaterally, a Palestinian state. Hello and welcome to the Full Comment Podcast. I'm Brian Lilly, your host, and a different kind of episode today. Prime Minister Mark Carney made his unilateral decision, his declaration of Canada's new foreign policy on Wednesday. It's true, foreign policy is something that the executive branch, led by the Prime Minister, is in charge of. But in March 2024, just over a year ago, Parliament was presented with a motion that sought to have Canada recognize a Palestinian state. It caused debate, it caused controversy, and in the end, it was not adopted. Instead, a different motion calling for movement towards a two-state solution was adopted. Canada's position going back decades has been that there should be a two-state solution. A sovereign and independent Israel living side by side with a sovereign and independent Palestinian state, but in peace. But to achieve that would require an end to terrorist attacks out of Gaza, out of the West Bank, and a recognition by the Palestinians of Israel's right to exist. And so far, those conditions have not been met. They never have been. Now we're going ahead with a new policy, one dreamt up by Mark Carney, our newly elected PM, who has a habit of making decisions and changing policy without the support or even the consultation of Parliament. And that's what he did with his announcement last Wednesday.
For the reasons I cited earlier, Canada intends to recognize the State of Palestine at the 80th session of the United Nations General Assembly in September 2025. This intention is predicated on the Palestinian Authority's commitment to much-needed reforms, including commitments by the Palestinian Authority's President Abbas to fundamentally reform its governance, to hold general elections in 2026 in which Hamas can play no part, and to demilitarize the Palestinian state. Canada will increase its efforts in supporting strong democratic governance in Palestine and the contributions of its people to a more peaceful and hopeful future. I spoke today with President Abbas at length to reaffirm his commitments.
Now, Carney's decision has brought him much applause from some elements of Canadian society, much derision from others. We will hear from the Conservatives and Conservative MP for Calgary Heritage, Shuvaloy Majumdar, in a little bit. He is someone who has experience working with building, nascent democracies, building democratic institutions, and he has thoughts on whether the caveats, the conditions that Carney has put in place are possible, even if the Palestinian Authority attempts to live up to them. But first, I had a chance to speak with Israel's ambassador to Canada, Iddo Moed. He is someone who is beside himself at Canada's decision. So, Ambassador, were you surprised by Prime Minister Mark Carney's decision to make this announcement on a Wednesday when most Canadians were likely wondering, was he going to be talking about a trade deal with the United States?
I was quite surprised. Yes, I can say that. We got some indications earlier in the week that something was in the works, but I think that given the fact that Prime Minister spoke about Palestinian so-called Zionist state, we were quite surprised when he came up with this statement, yes.
So, sorry, you just mentioned his comments about the Palestinian Zionist state. That was something that really upset a lot of Canadians in the Muslim community. The National Council of Canadian Muslims, they called on him to apologize for that. Many others did. To me, that seemed like, okay, an actual good statement, because he was calling, in my view, for a Palestinian state that would recognize Israel's right to exist. But on Wednesday, in doing what he did, he effectively, in my view, and I'd like to hear yours, said that, well, we're going to recognize a Palestinian state, even if it means acknowledging a Palestinian state that is run by people who do not respect Israel's right to exist.
Yes, exactly. And so there is a huge gap there, and that is something that is for us very difficult to understand. We look at the statement, we see the use of the word predicated on something, and my limited knowledge of English, I must admit, I had to check what does that mean, and it is assuming that the Palestinians will indeed follow through and do whatever they are committed to do, whatever Mahmoud Abbas told Prime Minister Carney in the phone conversation. But to me, at the end of the day, it's not about a deal. There is no deal here. It's not a tariff deal. There is no document here and there is no pledge. There is a sort of an indication from the Palestinians, which we've heard so many times from the same Mahmoud Abbas for 20 years. And so Prime Minister Carney is new to this, and I know that he's not fully familiar with the fact that Mahmoud Abbas has committed in writing to have elections, to stop the pay for slay practices, which is rewarding terrorists who have killed Israelis with a pension and so on.
Sorry, if I can pause you there, Ambassador. A lot of Canadians don't know what pay for slay is. They've never heard of that. They don't know it. So can you just take 30 seconds to a minute to explain what pay per slay is and why this is something that Israelis are just saying, no, that is a bridge too far.
So states and entities, let's say the Palestinian Authority, rewards Palestinian terrorists who have killed Israelis in terrorist actions by paying them a pension, which is, we consider that a pay for slay. So the more Israelis, the more significant the terrorist attack they inflicted on Israel, the higher payment they get. This is a practice that's been going on for many, many years. And this is happening with international money. Yeah, they could be in jail, they could be out of jail, but the families will get the money. But it's a practice that's being maintained, which in our eyes, it's an exact direct motivation for Palestinians to continue to attack Israel.
All right. So you mentioned the Prime Minister's caveat within his statement that said, and I'm reading from his statement, this intention is predicated on the Palestinian Authority's commitment to much needed reforms, including the commitments by the Palestinian Authority President Abbas to fundamentally reform its governance, to hold general elections in 2026, in which Hamas can play no part. Now, my understanding is that Mahmoud Abbas was elected 20 years ago. He was elected to a 4-year term. He hasn't held an election in 20 years, despite being elected to a 4-year term, and in part because he knows that Hamas would be elected in the West Bank as well. So he holds sway in the West Bank, not in Gaza. And if he held an election, Hamas would win. Am I wrong in that?
Let's unpack this. Let's start with the fact that Prime Minister Carney has pledged to do something now in return for something that may happen in 2026. There is not even a date set for it. And as you said, Mahmoud Abbas was elected into office many, many years ago. 20 years ago, elections have not been held because indeed Hamas holds the majority according to Palestinian polls. There is something else that we need to understand, that Hamas and Fatah, which is the faction that Mahmoud Abbas is from, these two organizations have never been able to reach an agreement amongst themselves how the Palestinian state or entity should look like, what it should look like. They're actually competing. They're actually fighting against each other for the same period of years. So Arab countries, China, the US, the European Union, many people try to sort of reconcile between those two parties to no avail. So they are in direct conflict. So it's not just the issue with Israel, it's the internal Palestinian issue that's completely unresolved. And so hoping for a Palestinian state on paper that somehow with the prayer of, I don't know what, a miracle will happen, is not going to make any difference. But even more important, and that is something that we haven't mentioned up until now, Brian, and that is that this deal does not make any difference for our hostages. It does not make any difference for ceasefire. It does only one thing. it gives Hamas an enormous boost and backwind that allows them to feel that they are not obliged to sit at the negotiating table. They are not obliged to talk about a ceasefire or release of the hostages. And that is, I think, the biggest problem that we have with this, exactly at the most sensitive period of time of this very crucial negotiation, where even the interlocutors, which is Egypt and Qatar, are putting their hands in the air and saying Hamas is not budging and not moving. At that same period, this is when Hamas gets this support, this international support, by recognition of a Palestinian state, which is a direct reward for the 7th of October.
Okay, so Prime Minister Carney would say, well, this is a movement towards peace. This will move us towards a two-state solution. What do you say to that?
It's moving us towards a state solution, just that it's, it does not. In no way, shape, or form does it move us closer. Because to have a two-state solution, you need a Palestinian, one single Palestinian that will say, I want to have a two-state solution. I don't think that Prime Minister Carney can name one. Even Mahmoud Abbas is not in for a two-state solution. He's never said that. And if he said it, he's not genuine in his intentions. There is no one single leader on the Palestinian side that is actually and genuinely looking to have a two-state solution. And so when Prime Minister Carney mentioned yesterday the Knesset decision about that, I just want to say one short thing, addition on the Israeli side, because I know that their whataboutism will come up very quickly, not from you, but maybe from the audience. And that is, what about the Israeli Knesset that rejected? The Israeli Knesset decided that this is not the time for a two-state solution because we've come to realize that there is a majority among Palestinians that don't want that. We've seen that through the 7th of October, and we've seen that through the Palestinian Authority's reaction to the 7th of October, which was not in any serious way condemnation or any efforts to mitigate the aftermath of this horrific attack on Israel.
Okay, well, that is exactly what I wanted to ask you about, was that a lot of Canadians will say, no. Israel rejects the two-state solution. It's not the Palestinians. The Palestinians want a two-state solution. Now, I've looked at what the leaders have said. I've looked at their positions. I know that that is not actually accurate, but there is this view within many in Western countries, especially among Western progressives, that say, well, it's Israel that rejects the two-state solution. Speak to that.
In Israel, we are dealing with the aftermath of October the 7th in several ways. One is, of course, the fact that we are doing whatever we can to get our hostages back and continue the military operation to defeat Hamas. The other part is that we have to come to terms with the new reality that even in spite of the fact that people like Vivian Silver, a Canadian Israeli, who gave her life when she was killed murdered by Hamas, who actually devoted her life for Palestinians to get from Gaza Strip to get medical treatment in Israel and many other things.
She was a peace activist.
Exactly, the Israeli peace camp. That peace camp was blown into oblivion by Hamas. And they came to realize that whatever we'll do, we'll first have to deal with the hate. We'll have first to do with the incitement, with the school books, with the atmosphere among Palestinians that reject the fact that Israel is there to stay. And so that's why at this point in time, nobody wants to talk about a two-state solution. We've done many concessions since the Oslo agreements, and we have come to realize that those concessions didn't bring us any closer. When we vacated the Gaza Strip, it was with the idea that that space will be fully controlled by the Palestinians. They will be able to prosper. They will be able to control themselves. There was an airport. There was a maritime port. All the infrastructure was there. But instead of using that infrastructure to build a state, there was a terror monster that was created, which now forces us to fight from house to house to make sure that as many people stay out of harm's way, but the hostages get back and Hamas is being defeated. So we've come to realize that in this new reality, you can't just decide to make peace. You don't just sign a piece of paper. you have to make sure that those who incite stop to incite, those who hate stop to hate, or otherwise we have to protect ourselves. So we have to protect ourselves with a military force. We have to make sure that the other side cannot attack us. And when the Palestinian Authority speaks about demilitarization, this is one of the issues that the Prime Minister Carney mentioned yesterday. I don't see that they are really genuine in that effect, because they're actually using their weapons against Israeli soldiers on the West Bank as we speak.
But does the Palestinian Authority have any ability to control the population in Gaza, to say, all right, it's time to lay down arms. We are going to move forward. We're going to find a way to live side by side? Does the Palestinian Authority have the political, the moral, the legal ability to do any of that?
Question. You know that after we left Gaza, there were elections held there. Hamas was actually voted, and what they did in power, and what they did is to throw out all the representatives of the Palestinian Authority. Some were thrown even from the roofs to the streets, but they were all either killed or thrown out of the Gaza Strip. And so the Palestinian Authority has no control and no say and no possibility to control what is going on there. And of course, they are not volunteering to do that because they know that Hamas controls it, and they know that they're going to fight.
So is Prime Minister Carney essentially negotiating for Canada's future position with a leader in Mahmoud Abbas who has no ability to deliver?
Absolutely. That is 100% true. Mahmoud Abbas not only has the ability to deliver, but he doesn't have the motivation to deliver.
All right, Ambassador, thank you for your time today.
Thank you very much for having me, Brad.
We need to take a quick break, but when we come back, a conversation with Eylon Levy, an official and at times unofficial spokesperson for the Israeli government and the Israeli people, who's been active since October 7th, and someone who knows and understands Canada and our place in the diplomatic world very well. And, of course, my conversation with Shuvaloy Majumdar, Conservative MP for Calgary Heritage. Back in moments.
This is Tristan Hopper, the host of Canada Did What?, where we unpack the biggest, weirdest, and wildest political moments in Canadian history you thought you knew and tell you what really happened. Stick around at the end of the episode to hear a sample of one of our favorite episodes. If you don't want to stick around, make sure you subscribe to Canada Did What? Everywhere you get podcasts.
Canada has the fourth largest Jewish population in the world after Israel, the United States, and France. It's one of the reasons that Israel pays so much attention to what Canada says and why our voice on these issues have mattered so greatly. Of course, we've had a growing Muslim and Arab population over the years as well, and that may be part of why the demographics have changed, and so has policy. But Eylon Levy is someone who has worked for the Israeli government, someone who has been an official and unofficial spokesperson. I met him back in January 2024 when I was in Tel Aviv, and we had a long discussion about why Canada's foreign policy mattered, why our position towards Israel and a two-state solution mattered. And so after Carney's announcement, I felt it only right to reach out and get his view on what was happening. So, Eylon, your first reaction when you heard from the mouth of Mark Carney that Canada was going to join France and Britain in recognizing a Palestinian state?
I was truly staggered that Canada would give Hamas a reward for the October 7th massacre and encourage more barbaric atrocities against Israelis. And let's be clear, that's exactly what is happening here. The world leaders who say they will recognize a non-existent Palestinian state in a response to the October 7th massacre are encouraging Palestinians to think of October 7th as independent state. They're telling them that terrorism works. And really shocking that world leaders who want to end this war and bring lasting peace are instead condemning us to everlasting war. Because these world leaders, including Mark Carney, are giving Hamas absolutely no reason to end this war and free the hostages. On the contrary, they're giving Hamas every incentive to keep this war going, to keep holding onto the hostages, because Hamas knows the pressure will be turned up on Israel and not where it belongs, on the jihadi group that started this war and refuses to release the hostages.
Well, the July 21st communique signed by Canada and 26 other countries, including France, the UK, Spain, Poland, Ireland, the list goes on, where the foreign affairs ministers of each of those countries signed on condemning Israel, not even mentioning Hamas. That was put out, and almost immediately thereafter, the talks in Doha broke down. Now you've got Britain, France, and Canada all saying we will acknowledge a Palestinian state, and the renewed talks that were supposed to be taking place have now broken down. This really is saying you don't have to do anything at the negotiating table, Hamas. You just leave it to us, and we'll set you up.
It's worse than that. Those foreign ministers actively sabotaged the negotiations at a critical point. Israel and Hamas were reportedly on the brink of a ceasefire agreement. And then the foreign ministers stepped in, condemned Israel, turned up the pressure on Israel, and Hamas hardened its demands. It started demanding the release of terrorists who took part in the October 7th massacre, and they blew up the talks. This is student politics we're seeing from world leaders who thought that they should pressure Israel instead of pressuring the side that was refusing a ceasefire. But let me tell you what I found especially staggering about Mark Carney's statement. It wasn't just that he said that recognizing a Palestinian state was in response to October 7th. Acknowledging the link to terrorism, oblivious that he is encouraging terrorism. It was the sheer arrogance of Mark Carney's statement. Because he said in that statement that he's conditioning recognition of a Palestinian state on a commitment to general elections next year in which Hamas can play no part, saying Hamas can have no role in the future governance of a Palestinian state. But Brian, Hamas is the most popular Palestinian party. According to Palestinian polls, it would win a landslide if elections were held today. In a head-to-head presidential election between Hamas leader Khaled Mashal and Palestinian Authority leader Mahmoud Abbas, Hamas would absolutely crush its rivals. So the West here is overlooking the root cause of the conflict, which is that the Palestinian national movement still opposes Israel in any borders whatsoever. Their goal is one Arab Islamic state from the river to the sea, as people are chanting on the streets of your country. And when people ignore that, when people fail to understand Hamas's ideology, they fail to understand that the only way we can have lasting peace is if this war ends with Hamas losing, knowing it's lost, and serious de-radicalization on the Palestinian side, so that they abandon this failed strategy of continuing to wage jihad against Israel, hoping that Israel will be destroyed one day. They were trying to achieve lasting peace. In their naivety, they've condemned us to everlasting war.
Well, in many ways, I would say, especially over the last week, but in general, Israel has been losing the PR war, the social media war, the media headlines war. And that became evident with the New York Times piece that showed the image of a child claiming it was starving when no, this was not the case. You've been down at the food distribution centers. There has been incredible pressure on Israel because of the claim that Israel is stopping aid from going in. You've been there. You've witnessed it. What did you see that the world didn't, because most of the media will not bother to look or report facts that aren't first approved by the Gaza Ministry of Health, aka Hamas?
And one of the main pillars in the propaganda war against Israel has been these allegations of famine or using hunger as a weapon of war. And we've been hearing it for the last 22 months, UN agencies crying wolf, and it never happened. But now there is a serious hunger crisis in Gaza, and we need to understand why. There's a hunger crisis because Hamas is continuing to wage this war, to divert aid, to loot it, and because UN agencies, their mechanism has completely broken down. I'll tell you what I saw in Gaza this week. I went in on Sunday to the Kerem Shalom crossing to see the piles of aid that are rotting in the sun because the UN is not picking it up. I'm talking as far as the eye can see, mountains of hummus beans and canned tuna and oil and pasta and lentils that the UN is failing to pick up. Israel is letting aid into Gaza now faster than the UN can pick it up. And nearly all of the aid that the UN picks up gets looted along the way. Don't take my word for it. Look at the UN's own database that says that 90% of the trucks they pick up are not reaching their destination. They're being looted on the way, whether by Hamas or by other armed actors. The UN system isn't working. You know what is working? Israel's effort, together with the Gaza Humanitarian Foundation, an American company, to try to get aid directly to the people who need it. The US Special Envoy Steve Witkoff was there with the Ambassador Mike Huckabee just a few hours ago, as the GHF announced it had distributed over 100 million meals inside Gaza. And that's the challenge. How do you get food to people who need it and make sure that it can't go to Hamas? Because Hamas has been able to hijack it, to divert it, to tax it, and make an absolute fortune that is allowing it to finance this war and to carry on. That's why Hamas is demanding, as part of the ceasefire deal, that aid not go through the GHF and only go through the UN, because it knows it's a broken mechanism that it can exploit to enrich itself. But you know, Brian, the real question is not how much aid is going into Gaza or how it's distributed around Gaza. It's the fact that as long as Hamas remains inside and underneath civilians, whatever aid, whatever supplies you let in are going to end up enriching Hamas. And the debate that real humanitarians need to be having, who genuinely want to help civilians, and helping civilians means freeing them from Hamas rule and ending its tyranny, is the question of how you separate civilians from the Hamas terrorists to make sure that Hamas cannot exploit those supplies in order to keep prolonging a war that should have ended a long time ago.
How do you expect things to play out over the coming months as we head towards that September meeting of the UN General Assembly, where there will be more pressure, where there will be international calls, where people who aren't paying attention will say, oh, well, the United Nations says, therefore it's good. You've got this PR war over food distribution. You've got this PR war that you've been fighting since October 7th as a spokesperson, official and otherwise, for Israel. How do you push back in the face of this, or is that side of it just lost? And even if eventually Israel physically defeats Hamas, they will be strong politically because of their ability to harness social media and gullible Westerners.
Yeah, Israel is winning the battle on the ground, but let's be clear that what is happening, the battle that's being fought out on TV screens, is exactly what Hamas leader Yahya Sinwar wanted. He was not only willing, he wanted to sacrifice his own civilians on the altar of jihad and create images of suffering that would cause cracks between Israel and its Western allies and lead Western allies under intense domestic political pressure to take actions that will in fact make this conflict worse, like what they're doing now when they blew up the ceasefire talks. This was Hamas's plan all along. That's why Hamas spent years preparing for this war by digging a network of military tunnels, longer than the New York subway, underneath people's feet, fighting from those tunnels with the shafts poking out inside homes and schools and hospitals in order to create images of suffering that would cause cracks between Israel and its Western allies. And I'm afraid the West has fallen into that trap, because at exactly the moment that we needed to turn the screws on Hamas to accept a ceasefire and release at least some of those poor hostages who are shackled and tortured under Gaza, they decided to put up pressure on Israel. And that's prolonging this war. So now I think there are only four scenarios for where we can move forward. One, maybe the least likely, is the possibility of a temporary ceasefire. It's what Israel and the United States were pushing for, a 60-day ceasefire, get half the hostages out, negotiate on how to end the war. I don't think there's any chance of that anymore. Hamas has no reason to want a temporary ceasefire, thanks to Mark Carney and his friends. Another option is to try to negotiate a permanent end of the war. But that depends on Hamas being willing to relinquish power. Because if it doesn't, any reconstruction of Gaza means the reconstruction of Hamas. And if it doesn't relinquish power, no Arab force is going to want to take responsibility when you've got 20,000 Hamas terrorists running around with guns. So it's not clear there's an option to end the war either. There is another option, which is Israel decides to go all in into the areas of Gaza it hasn't touched, because that's where the hostages are. Say it's going for full military conquest of Gaza, but that's very dangerous and risky. And the IDF chief of staff is reportedly saying, look, this is going to endanger the hostages. This puts their lives in danger because their Hamas captors have instructions to put a bullet in their head if we get anywhere close. And then there is another option, which I wonder whether is being discussed in policy circles, which is to try to freeze the war. Instead of going further into Gaza, but definitely not retreating, saying Israel controls 75% of the Gaza Strip now. And if Hamas wants Israel to withdraw from any of that territory, it's going to have to give back hostages. Those hostages cannot remain trapped in the dungeons of Gaza any further. And by the way, I have to say, it's a tragedy that we've reached this point. Just this week, we saw all the countries of the Arab League condemning the October 7th massacre, calling Hamas to release the hostages and lay down its arms. And I'm asking, where were you for the last 22 months? You've finally come around to accepting the legitimacy of Israel's war goals after Hamas's invasion on October 7th. Imagine how much suffering could have been avoided if Hamas's Qatari patrons had said 22 months ago that Hamas must release the hostages. But they left it too little, too late, and as a result, Hamas feels emboldened to continue this war, and we need global pressure on Hamas and its patrons now. It's game over. Gaza is not going back to Hamas rule. The hostages have to be let out.
And the Arab League denouncing Hamas and putting pressure on them after Canada and other Western countries decided no, the pressure should be on Israel. Do you have any final thoughts, Eylon, for Canadians who are not following this as closely as I might, but who are sympathetic to Israel, but wondering as they look at the headlines what they should feel, what they should support? Final thoughts for them.
You know, yesterday, Islamic Jihad, Hamas's allies in Gaza, released a hostage video of a young hostage called Ron Braslavsky. He looks like a hollowed skeletal shell of a human being, shaking, sobbing, begging for his life, writhing on the floor, untreated injuries, saying he can't bear to be there anymore and begging to be rescued. And this is a sophisticated propaganda video that they're filming in a tunnel deep underground with hostages we know are being shackled. Their hands and legs are shackled and they're not being fed properly. And the hostages are a basic humanitarian cause. It's not about politics. It's not about left and right. It's not about pro-Israel or anti-Israel. Hamas should never have taken the hostages in the first place. And this war can only end when all the hostages are free and when Israelis are confident that Hamas can never take hostages again. Because we just can't take the risk of an armed jihadi terrorist group invading, marching straight into people's homes, into their living rooms, into their bedrooms, snatching children from their beds, snatching young people from a music party, and abducting them into tunnels in Gaza. That can never, ever happen again. That's why this war has to end with all the hostages home and with Hamas never again free to take hostages again.
Eylon, thanks so much for the time.
Thank you, Brian.
And of course, while it is great to hear from people like Ambassador Moed or Eylon Levy, of course, this is a Canadian issue, Canadian policy. A Conservative MP, Shuvaloy Majumdar, is someone who's worked in foreign policy for a long time. He has helped build nascent democratic institutions in foreign countries. He has been a foreign policy advisor to the Harper government, and he has been, for the past several years, a Conservative member of Parliament. We reached out to him and spoke on Friday. So, Shuv, your initial reaction to Mark Carney's announcement, kind of proclamation. I understand the executive branch holds sway over foreign policy, but this is something that was debated in the House not long ago. And Mark Carney has just decided, okay, we'll go against what has been Canada's position for decades. What were your thoughts?
Outrage. Here's a prime minister who keeps handing victories to terrorists. This isn't the only time his government has rewarded propaganda with concessions. It's not the only time that the prime minister has acted for political expediency over principle, and all while doing it wrapped in the Canadian flag. He actually had the audacity to say that he's speaking on behalf of all Canadians. That's not the case. Parliament voted this motion down last year. Nobody debated it or voted for it today. There is no mandate. The only Canadians he's speaking for, it's a minority government and with a parliament that's barely convened. And the only Canadians he's actually speaking for are the extremists in his own caucus.
You are someone who, when I first met you more years ago than I care to recall, you were working in foreign countries, including Iraq and Afghanistan, but elsewhere, trying to help build fledgling democracies. Now, Mark Carney is saying this is all predicated on elections in the Palestinian territories. This is all predicated on respect for democracy. Given that there is no history in the last 20 years, at least, of democracy, and before that it was a checkered past at best, what is your takeaway on that in
Yeah,
terms of is that even possible? Is it feasible?
isn't it insane? So the prime minister has set one of his conditions for recognition of Palestinian statehood that he would do this fall in September at the UN General Assembly. He set the condition for something that would have to be realized in 2026. How can you set a condition a year out in advance before a decision that you intend to take this year? It's one of the most fantastical things I think I've ever really seen, where he's expecting a 20-year dictator in the Palestinian Authority to all of a sudden wake up one morning, and despite the assurances that the Palestinian leadership have provided the Western world for 20 years and never delivered on them, he expects that somehow, because he spoke to him, that all these reforms will happen a year later from the date in which they intend to recognize the authority and the state, which would be this fall. It makes no sense at all.
Now, I've spoken to several people about this, and they all say, "Look, hold the elections, and Hamas will win." So again, that's another reward for a terrorist organization. Mahmoud Abbas can promise this. He knows politically that he's toast.
Listen, whether we can all agree that terror organizations should not be competing in democratic elections. And the idea that Palestinians should have elections, should have a state, is not being debated. The question is the nature of the state that would emerge and whether or not it's capable of dispensing with long held policies. The Palestinian Authority itself has been sponsoring pay to slay policies in which they reward terrorists with plum pensions that last their families for generations. They've not dispensed with this. They were sanctioned by the United States yesterday for carrying out this constant genocidal rhetoric against Jews and Israelis. We haven't seen any of the trust that the state needs to have or the authority needs to build toward a state. And until they achieve that trust and actually dispense with the policies that prolong conflict, prolong war, expand and export hatred, there's not much reason to believe that the Palestinian Authority is going to move toward legitimate elections. I mean, let's be very clear. Prime Minister Carney is saying to the world that he is looking to recognize this state this year for things that the Palestinian Authority will promise to do next year, and over 20 years has earned absolutely no trust and demonstrated no real progress toward actually helping alleviate suffering for Palestinians and helping Palestinians establish a better government for themselves.
What was the old line from Popeye and Wimpy? "I'll gladly pay you Tuesday for a hamburger today." It sounds like
Yep.
that sort of thing. But
Yeah.
Mark Carney is supposed to be the adult in the room, Shuv. He's supposed to be part of the smart set. I mean, we were told not only are we getting Mark Carney, but we're getting all these smart bureaucrats around him and chiefs of staff and people who are going to run the government properly. And this seems like a foolhardy move. Even if this is where you want to end up, doing it now under these conditions doesn't look like it will uphold Canadian traditions. It doesn't look like it will hold up Canadian ideals. So, were we hoodwinked in the election by Mark Carney, or is he just showing that on foreign policy he is completely naive?
It's a great question. I'd like to try and ask the opposite question. Let's assume the prime minister knows exactly what he's doing, that this is not a measure of bad advice or incompetence, but deliberate decision making. It reveals something more insidious. It reveals that he will put political expediency for his political stability in his party by pandering to the extremists, by forsaking the national interests of the country, by putting the Liberal Party first and Canada second. And two, doing this on the eve of a self-declared date for when the prime minister wanted to resolve trade negotiations with the United States, knowing that this is an antagonistic position from those of our most important ally as they are engaged toward developing a peace in the Middle East that is a very complex region to work in and has obviously been very turbulent. Doing this without even having called the American president or the administration to seek advice and to seek guidance on whether or not this is an opportune moment to make these decisions as a sovereign country. I just think it's an abrogation of responsibility. And if it's an intentional one, then he is actively deciding against the interests of Canada, both for what we stand for in the world in terms of international peace and in the bilateral relationship with America, which we need to resolve for working Canadians as soon as possible.
I know there's an awful lot of Canadians that just want to do the opposite of whatever Donald Trump does or says, but that is not necessarily in our best economic interest. And yet Mark Carney seems to be leaning into that. And as I said in a column the other day, this is either deliberate or it's incompetent. And I don't know which is the worst answer. And you seem to be at a similar position on this.
I'd like to think the Prime Minister is a knowledgeable man. He's introduced himself to the public as well-traveled internationally, sophisticated in global conversations. This is kind of his bailiwick, right?
Look,
So,
I'm as someone who's covered him, I know him to be a smart man, a thoughtful man.
so let's assume
This
that this
this
is
is a
intentional.
this is a bad decision.
It's a bad decision that profits him politically, domestically. In his mind, I believe that this is something that he's doing. Again, not speaking for all Canada. There's been no parliamentary debate. There's been no discussion. He's gone against the decision of Parliament from last year. Parliament seems to be an institution he doesn't have a lot of time for, and now he's acting for a very narrow extremist voice inside his own party, not the country.
All right, where do we go from here? Does Canada recover? I mean, in some ways, I guess we can be thankful that after 10 years of the Trudeau government, our voice doesn't carry much weight on the international stage. I know liberals might say, oh, no, that's due to the Harper decade, but really, we have diminished in terms of the strength of our voice on the international stage. We used to be a country that mattered and that people would look to for moral clarity. I don't think that we can be looked upon at that for that at this point.
Look, with the United States, the most important thing for us to establish is that we will go eyeball to eyeball with any American administration on the core interests of Canadians, our safety, our security, our prosperity, our values. We'll go eyeball to eyeball with them on the interests of Canadians and also stand shoulder to shoulder with them on the rivals we have to confront in a world that's deeply disrupted. This is a world that changes very quickly in every minute, and it requires a government that's switched on and understands what the strengths of our country are. The core strengths of our country are our capacity to unleash resources, whether it's oil and gas to fuel growth and development and reduce pollution, or critical minerals that will be behind every major technological change that's coming in the years ahead. Unleashing these resources gives us an international stake and opens up prosperity domestically for our people here. It's about our country having made the decision to have ambition, to matter in the world in the way that represents the best of Canada and the best of our interests.
All right, Shuvaloy Majumdar, thanks so much for the time today.
Thank you for yours.
This was a quickly put together episode of the Full Comment podcast. And yes, while there were several different viewpoints put forward, there is a definite slant to this. And that is not something that I will apologize for. I, like most of my colleagues at Post Media, have a particular view when it comes to Israel, when it comes to a two-state solution. And we're not going to turn around and say that suddenly we have to put forward both sides in a false equivalency. That is not something that's going to happen. So I welcome your comments. Some will be supportive, some will be in opposition. But the point here was to put forward points of view that you wouldn't hear in most media. And I hope we accomplish that goal. Full Comment is a Post Media podcast. My name's Brian Lilly, your host. This episode was produced by Andre Prue. Theme music by Bryce Hall. Kevin Libin is the executive producer. Remember, you can hit subscribe, and please do, wherever you're listening to your podcast. Leave us a review. Send this by email to your friends. Let people know about us. Thanks for listening. Until next time, I'm Brian Lilly.
Here's that clip from Canada Did What? I promised you. But the late 1960s, you have members of the Montreal Police who can spend their entire shift rushing from one FLQ bombing to another. Here's how New Year's Eve 1968 played out for Robert Cote, a member of the Montreal Police bomb squad, which put him at the forefront of fighting the FLQ during this period. He was supposed to be at home with his wife, who had just miscarried twin daughters. But instead, at 11 p.m., he's called out to Montreal City Hall to investigate a bomb that had just gone off. He's en route with sirens blaring when he's told, actually, don't bother with the exploded bomb. There's an unexploded bomb on the other side of City Hall you have to defuse. And then, right after snipping the wires on the City Hall bomb, Cote has to speed west where a third bomb has just exploded outside a federal building.
The bombing started in April and May of 1963. That's when the first bombings took place. And the mailbox bombings were the most famous part of the whole thing, which was basically on the Thursday night and Friday night leading into the Victoria Day weekend in 1963. So, and initially they started attacking these symbols of federalism, federal institutions, whether it was the Montreal Post Office or Revenue Canada. But the bombings escalated as time went on in terms of the size of the bombs and the powerfulness of these bombs.
If you want to hear the rest of the story, make sure you subscribe to Canada Did What? Everywhere you get your podcasts.